Good evening. I'm Rabbi Joshua Davidson, Senior Rabbi of Temple Emanu-El, and I'm honored to welcome you for this important collaboration between our Streicker Center, the New York Jewish Agenda, the Forward, the Jewish Community Relations Council of New York, Lincoln Square Synagogue, and the Marlene Meyerson JCC. In 2 weeks, we New Yorkers head to the polls for primary elections at a moment of national urgency. Lingering inflation, COVID, election denialism, ever-present anti-Semitism and anti-Israel rhetoric, racism and other forms of hatred, including recent violent attacks on the Muslim community, a never-ending parade of mass shootings, a war in Ukraine, and of course dramatic Supreme Court decisions which have only exacerbated our deep national divide. All of these demand our voices be heard. And here in Manhattan, we face the unusual scenario imposed upon us by redistricting, a primary in which two veteran House Democrats, each of whom holds significant national leadership positions, Representatives Carolyn Maloney and Jerry Nadler, are facing off against one another and against attorney, business leader, organizer, and prior candidate Suraj Patel. We're greatly honored that the three of them join us tonight to address some of the exigencies we face. I would add that the fourth candidate on the ballot, Ashmi Sheth, is not here because of fundraising and polling thresholds. Now, one might ask, why is the Jewish community hosting this forum? Well, as the late political scientist Leonard Fine once said, in the era of the modern state, there is no path to the fulfillment of Jewish interests and ideals that does not lead through the halls of government. And we believe that the well-being of all Americans, indeed of every nation on the planet and of the planet itself, reflect Jewish interests and ideals. Jews of an early America considered the right to participate in the electoral process a sacred privilege. They considered it a mitzvah, a holy obligation, and it is still a holy obligation. What we do or don't do now through Election Day will determine the character of the nation and the nature of the society we leave for our children and their children. That is why the Jewish community is hosting this forum. 3 final notes. First, for the hundreds of you joining us online, you too will be able to submit questions using the chat function. Second, we thank all of you for joining us and hope you'll return to Temple Emanu-El for other important conversations, including evenings with Ambassador Nikki Haley, Vice President Al Gore, Justice Elena Kagan, and Presidents Bill Clinton and George W. Bush. Third, and most important, don't forget to vote. Early voting begins on Saturday and extends through August 21st. Primary day itself is August 23rd. Now let me introduce tonight's wonderful moderators. Before co-founding New York Jewish Agenda to amplify the diverse voices of our New York Jewish community, Matt Nozenchuk served as the Obama administration's liaison to American Jewry and as a member of the National Security Council. Previously, he worked at the State Department, the Department of Homeland Security, and the Justice Department, where he was awarded distinctions for his advocacy for LGBTQ rights. Jody Redoran became editor-in-chief of The Forward, the nation's leading Jewish journalism media outlet, in 2019, after 21 years as a reporter and editor at the New York Times, including service as Jerusalem bureau chief. Under her leadership, The Forward has been honored by the American Jewish Press Association, the Religion News Association, the Society for Features Journalism, New York's Deadline Club, and the LA Press Club. Together, they will introduce our speakers and explain tonight's format. Now, please welcome them all.
Good evening. Good evening. Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight. If you're here in person or joining us online, thank you, Rabbi Davidson, and all of our partners who co-hosted putting on tonight's event. And good evening to our candidates and to all of you. We had more than 3,000 people sign up. We want this discussion tonight to help 12th District voters make their difficult, critical choice during these midterm elections. So we've set strict time limits, generally 60 seconds, for each candidate's answers, and we will be calling time. We do want the candidates to interact and respond to each other, so we generally will be giving each a chance to do so.
Given that the three of you met for similar debates last night and last week, we framed our questions tonight through a decidedly Jewish lens. We're not going to repeat the questions that you've heard about crime, immigration, housing, or whether you all think that President Biden should run for re-election, because as of last night, you do.
So, for the audience, if you have a question that you want to ask, please write it on the cards that are being passed around here and hand them to the folks you see in the aisles here at Temple Emanu-El, or post them in the Q&A on Zoom.
Actually, there's those of you who are online, I think you already got instructions. There's an email address for you to send your questions to. Sorry.
Got it.
Last minute change.
So, to get us started, so please think of questions, and we will ask some. To get us started, each candidate will have 90 seconds to make their best case for their candidacy. In alphabetical order, we'll start with Representative Maloney, then Representative Nadler, then Mr. Patel. Representative Maloney, you have 90 seconds.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, and thank you to Rabbi Joshua Davidson, Temple Emanu-El, and the Streicker Center, and all the hosts. We are in a dangerous and perilous time with anti-Semitism on the rise and hate on the rise. This extreme Supreme Court has bulldozed women's rights, weakened the separation between church and state, and gutted our gun laws and much more, and they're just getting started. I have a record of delivering results. I've repeatedly been rated first, second, or third most effective member of Congress in getting things done by 2 different rating agencies. I have brought to my district the 2 largest construction projects funded by the federal government in the whole country: the 2nd Avenue Subway and the East Side Connector, which will be opening up next year in Grand Central. I've authored and passed over 80 bills. 12 have been signed into law by presidents. And this morning, I started with many of you with a meeting with Governor Hochul, where she signed a bill patterned after a bill that I wrote called the Holocaust Never Again Forget Education Act. As a former teacher, I often see education as a way of meeting our challenges. I've been a strong supporter of increasing funding for the nonprofit security grant program, funding Israel. You don't have to be Jewish to love Israel and work for the issues important to the Jewish community. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Representative Maloney. Representative Nadler, 90 seconds.
Well, first of all, thank you all for hosting this. My history as a committed Jew and Zionist goes way back. I started carrying a pushka for Keren Kayemet when I was 8 or 9 years old. In high school, I was a member of Mizrahi Hatzair. In college, I formed a chapter of the ZOA. And I have continued my commitment to Israel and to Jewish values ever since. Now, when I was elected to Congress in 1992, there were 8 Jewish members from New York. There's now only 1. If I'm not reelected, the Jewish community will be the largest community in New York, the only large community in New York without any representation. I have 3 positions that are important. Number 1, I am the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, I'm the dean of the Jewish delegation, and I'm the dean of the New York delegation. I've been able to use these 3 positions as a powerful base on Jewish and other issues. So, for example, I've led the fight against BDS. I've been able to pass anti-BDS resolutions last year. Anti-Terrorism, the Anti-Domestic Terrorism Act, in addition to which I am a principled progressive, and I've been able to show that you can be progressive and pro-Israel. And that's been very important in opposing BDS. I started opposing BDS when it first started, when the Durban Conference occurred back in 2002, I think it was. I led the opposition to it and got the Ford Foundation to stop supporting BDS.
Thank you, Representative Nadler. Mr. Patel, in 90 seconds.
Thank you very much, everyone, for being here and for hosting this. My name is Suraj Patel. I used to work for President Obama. And President Obama used to reference the need for generational change. And he would talk about the book of Exodus. And he said that Moses, who defeated Pharaoh's armies, parted the Red Sea, and arrived at the River Jordan, said he could go no more, that God had a different plan, that it fell upon the Joshua generation to build a nation. So you see, generational change is in our DNA. It is in our culture. It's necessary because the challenges change. Across the world, liberal democracy is under attack. It's under attack from the old forces of gerrymandering and voter suppression, but it's also under attack from new forces like misinformation, cyber warfare. To defeat them, to make a new case for New York values, we need a new generation of leaders who understand them. Let me tell you about mine. You see, I stand on the shoulders of sufferers, risk takers, and optimists. My parents are in this audience right now. We used to sleep on a one-bedroom apartment floor above the bodega that we ran. My dad worked for the MTA. We used to sort newspapers to make an extra dime at that store, and I'm now sitting with two of the most esteemed members of the United States Congress on a stage. This is an only in New York moment. You have the opportunity to make responsible generational change in 12 days. I want to close with this. In Hindu scripture, the god of wind and the god of fire are best friends. You see, because wind is pervasive and continuous. And the winds of anti-Semitism and hate are rising. Uncontrolled, they turn into a blaze. Make the responsible choice. Make change.
I'm going to ask that people hold their applause after these intros, just because we want to get to more questions, okay? As Rabbi Davidson said, this is an unusual primary with two incumbents due to the redistricting. Mr. Nadler and Ms. Maloney have both been in Congress since 1993, and each, as they mentioned, chair important committees. So the New York City congressional delegation is going to lose some of its power of seniority next year, no matter what the outcome is. Starting with you, Mr. Nadler, I want to ask, why should East Side Democrats who have voted for Ms. Maloney for the past 30 years switch to your camp? You have 60 seconds.
Well, because although Carolyn and I have been together on many issues, we have real differences in our voting records. And I'll mention just three. Carolyn voted for the war in Iraq, which killed hundreds of thousands of people. She was gullible enough to believe the misrepresentations of the Bush administration. I voted against it. Carolyn voted for the Patriot Act. Again, the Bush administration's huge surveillance bill, which all civil liberties people in ACLU were vehemently against. I voted against it. And finally, Carolyn voted against the Iran deal. I voted for it. And that Iran deal, as you know, is what has kept Iran from developing a nuclear bomb with which to threaten Israel and the rest of the Middle East. President Trump stupidly took us out of it, and we're desperately trying to get back into it now, because if we don't get back into that deal, if the Iranians don't agree with it, and if too much time passes, then we'll have to deal with Iran with an atomic bomb. And if Carolyn's vote had prevailed, Iran would have an atomic bomb already.
Thank you. Ms. Maloney, please hold your applause. Ms. Maloney, same basic question to you. Why should West Siders abandon the man they've supported for 3 decades to vote for you?
He's citing votes 20 years ago, right after 9/11. Bush lied, Rumsfeld lied. I regret that vote on Iraq. I support my position on the Iran deal. I didn't think it was long enough, strong enough, or enforceable, and I think I was right voting against it. And on the Patriot Act, Obama said this bill alone saved 50 different times people tried to attack our city. We were told that they were, anyway. But the reason I think you should vote for me over him is my record of accomplishment. Instead of talking, I actually work and get things done. I built the 2nd Avenue subway.
Please
we
hold
both
your
went
applause.
to Congress at the same time. He was going to build his rail freight. He's never built it. I've authored and passed 70 important bills that protect people, help our environment, and move our country forward. So I chair the Oversight Committee. I was a former chair of the Women's Committee. And during this time of Roe, we need strong, determined women
Thank
to go
you.
to
Thank you.
Washington
That's time.
and fight to reverse that terrible decision.
We're just getting started. We'll get back
Okay.
to some of those issues, I promise. Please, let's give the candidates the most time we can by not spending too much on the applause. Mr. Patel, you spoke already about your call for generational change. But I want to add to that question by saying, why should New Yorkers give up not one, but both of these veterans to be represented by a newcomer who will have less power on Capitol Hill than either of them do, given the way seniority works?
Well, first off, let's recall why we are in this race in the first place together. It is a comeuppance that in November of last year, it was reported that Congresswoman Maloney attempted to gerrymander this district by age and race to cut out Latino and young voters from her district, and Congressman Nadler gave up some of his turf in order to help her save a re-election. Supreme Court of New York threw that out because it was unconstitutional. It was an unconstitutional gerrymander. First things first. But secondly, I will say that clout in Washington can come from experience and seniority, but it can also come from effectiveness. Hakeem Jeffries has only been in office for 12 years, and he's third in the House leadership. Congressman Torres is making a new generational case for Israel and for the U.S.-Israel relationship. There's an incredible amount of power that comes with the ability to generate conversation. Just last week, when I tweeted in support of the Iron Dome funding as a non-Jew person of color, I, have a third of their combined followers, but I got about 18 times their likes. And the reason is because there's a power to making a generational case for our shared values.
Thanks. That's time. Thank you. Next question. So this year, with the creation of its super PAC, we've seen AIPAC be active in this year's midterm elections in a way that is totally different and new. They've spent $26 million in the primaries so far, including $4 million to defeat Andy Levin in Michigan last week. And they've endorsed, as you know, dozens of Republicans, including many who wanted to throw out the results of the 2020 election. Many have questioned this approach and said that AIPAC has lost its way. So, Ms. Nadler and Ms. Maloney, you are both have been AIPAC stalwarts. You've spoken at their conferences, you've had their endorsements, and Mr. Nadler, you're also back now by J Street. I'd like to know what each of you can think of AIPAC's new strategy and activity. Do you still consider yourself aligned with AIPAC's approach to Israel, the conflict with the Palestinians, and the U.S.-Israel relation?
Well, first of all, I believe both Jerry and I are endorsed by AIPAC. We're both endorsed by AIPAC. And
Right, so I'm asking how you feel about what they're doing in this campaign.
Well, I haven't seen those millions of dollars they're spending that you're talking about. But I think that it's important to elect good people to office. And if they have people they feel are going to be allies to Israel and be good representatives and support people, I think that's fine. But I'd like to respond to Mr. Patel. I would say that our seniority and our experience is an asset, particularly during this time of crisis in our government. And it's not a time to send to Washington rookies who don't have the experience and are not, or the clout, really, to get things done. So I did want to respond to his statement that experience and seniority are not important, and experience on all of these issues that we are confronting. In terms of women's issues, it's been a prime focus of mine, a former chair of the Women's Caucus, protecting a woman's right to choose, and many of these challenges that we have and how to confront them.
You're out of time, sorry. Mr. Patel, you want to respond to that, and then we'll get back to the AIPAC question in a second.
Yeah, absolutely. I understand that experience and seniority are important, but I have experience as well. My experience is of fighting foreclosures, of working for President Obama, of being an attorney who teaches business ethics at NYU, and I bring a new perspective to these challenges. Now, 1990s Democrats on almost every major issue, from climate change to gun control to abortion rights, failed to codify Roe, failed to codify Obergefell, failed to codify contraception rights. And so what has seniority gotten you? Certainly not, certainly record storefront vacancies on Amsterdam Avenue or 2nd Avenue, a livability crisis in the city, rising crime, and small businesses starts in this city at its lowest level in a decade.
Okay. A very short response.
Okay. When I first went to Congress, I announced for Congress on the day of the Casey decision where they were rolling back Roe. I went to the Women's Caucus, and abortion was not even, it was considered too controversial to be even part of the Women's Caucus. My first bill or motion was to make it part of the Women's Caucus. And the entire time that I've been in Congress, we have not had the majority in the House to codify Roe. Only after we elected 100 new women members of Congress and men, like-minded men, do we have the power now to pass it. So usually we were fighting it. I used to keep a scorecard on Roe, and when it got to over 350 bills that had passed the United States Congress, chipping away at Roe v. Wade, I stopped. But now with this Supreme Court, this extreme, dangerous Supreme Court, they've absolutely bulldozed women's rights into the ground.
We're a little far afield of our question and of Mr. Patel's comments, so we're going to bring us back here. Mr. Nadler, how do you feel about AIPAC's campaign tactics this season? Do you feel they've made the right decision, and are you still aligned with them on Israel?
Well, the problem isn't AIPAC. The problem is Citizens United. We passed a number of years ago the McCain-Feingold bill to get rid of dark money and this kind of PAC money from politics, but the Supreme Court said in Citizens United we couldn't do that. This year, I tried again, and I got a bill passed the House that would outlaw this sort of soft money, but it hasn't passed the Senate. And as long as that is true, AIPAC and J Street and everybody else will have to use this kind of soft money. With respect to their supporting insurrectionists, I very strongly disagree with that. And as to Andy Levin, I don't comment on other races.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you,
We're just
Mr. Nadler. We're going to move on. So, Mr. Patel, right, what is your take? And do you see your politics on the Israel and the U.S.-Israel relationship aligned with AIPAC, J Street, or some other group?
Well, first off, I think that this is one of the reasons I'm running for this seat and my home. It is because we need to ensure that the U.S.-Israel relationship does not become a one-party issue. Now, if you don't elect young Democrats in places like New York City, who want to support the U.S.-Israel relationship, and then the conversation is monopolized by only one small group of very vocal Democrats who are younger, then this relationship will become a partisan issue, not a historical bipartisan issue, which is why I'm in this race. That's the distinction between me and my two opponents. I'm offering for the next 10 years a representative that will be aligned on this issue and will be able to make a new generational case to Democrats to stay stalwart with our ally, our liberal democracy in the Middle East, the only one that supports LGBTQIA rights, and to secure its defense. That's why last week I met with Consul General Asaf Zamir to discuss deepening our economic security and cultural ties.
20 seconds.
20 seconds.
Thank you very much. The fact is, I'm endorsed by both AIPAC and J Street. I'm the only candidate of whom that's true because of my success in deepening the Israel-American relationship and in getting progressives to stand with Israel, which no one else has been able to do, and I have been able to do that, and that's why you get votes like 421-7 on funding Iron Dome.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Nadler.
I will just say that there is little daylight between Congressman Nadler's and my positions on these issues. It is telling that you have not seen the flood of outside money from AIPAC or DMFI or J Street into this district. So let's not pretend that somehow one of us on this stage is not a stalwart ally of Israel and that the others are because they both have AIPAC endorsements who only endorse the
We're
incumbents.
going to move on. We're going to move on. Okay, so one key difference, we've already heard this tonight, between our two veteran candidates is their votes on the Iran nuclear deal in 2015. Mr. Nadler, you voted for it. Ms. Maloney, you voted against it. Negotiations, as you know, are now underway for a possible reprise of the deal, and we just heard this week that the European Union has put a final draft on the table. Mr. Nadler, if you had the 2015 vote to do over again, would you vote the same way? And how would you vote if a similar deal comes back to Congress? 60 seconds.
I would absolutely vote the same way because, as I said before, the nuclear deal, the JCPOA, is the only thing preventing Iran from getting a nuclear bomb. They had 10,000 kilograms of 20% enriched uranium. Under the deal, they were only allowed to have 300 kilograms of 3.7% enriched uranium. They sold the rest to the Russians, which is fine because Russia already had nuclear bombs, and that kept us kept them from getting a nuclear bomb. And that deal put in the most intrusive inspections of any deal at all to make sure the Iranians couldn't cheat. And we, as I said, we stupidly got out of it, and I hope to God we can get back into it, and that the Iranians will permit us to get back into it, because if we don't, Iran will have a nuclear bomb in pretty short order.
Thank you. Ms. Maloney, 60 seconds.
Well, I support my vote. At the time, I had asked them if they would agree that they would not spend the money that was coming back to them in terrorism, promoting terrorism. They refused. They said, just agree, and then we'll agree that we won't use the money for terrorism. Well, we know what happened. They immediately got the money, and they started exporting terrorism all over the place. I think it wasn't long enough. I wasn't strong enough. It wasn't enforceable enough. They cheated from day one. We all know that. They've taken the cameras out. They have cheated the whole time on this. And I would say that the day that the agreement came out, I'll never forget it. They were showing them in Tehran rejoicing and saying, death to America, death to Israel, and they started anti-ballistic test that is an offensive weapon going to other places. So I didn't trust Iran then. I don't trust it now. I support President Biden's statement that says that he will only agree to an agreement that will prevent Iran from getting a nuclear bomb.
So would you vote against the one that's being proffered now?
Well, I have to look at every document before I decide, and I support the president's position that it has to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear bomb. The first one did not prevent it. It actually gave them, after a certain number of years, they could create it. They could, and it would have been accepted and legal. So that's why I voted against it. It didn't keep them from having a nuclear bomb, period.
Thank you. Mr. Patel, what's your position on the Iran nuclear deal and how to best keep Tehran from getting a nuclear weapon?
Well, first off, I think that Congresswoman Maloney's statement is inaccurate. It did prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon, first off. Secondly, I will say that the #1 goal is to prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon, shattering the Non-Proliferation Treaty once and for all. We see what happens with Russia and Ukraine when your opponent has nuclear weapons. You are hamstrung to do much about it afterwards. And so I support President Biden's efforts to do the one thing we can. Iran is 4 times the size of Iraq. The cost of military action, let's be sober and clear-minded about it, is not really an option. So if President Biden is currently in, or the negotiators are currently in Geneva right now negotiating this deal, let's wait for it to come. But I trust President Biden and the State Department to put together a deal that is acceptable to all parties to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon by all means necessary. And that's why I would support it.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Nadler, you can briefly
I just want to point out with reference to Carolyn said, yes, the Iranians were developing ballistic missiles, but that was not the purpose of and yes, they are terrorists, but the purpose of the Iran deal was to stop them from getting nuclear weapons. Better a terrorist non-nuclear state than a terrorist nuclear state. And they only took the cameras out about 4 weeks ago, not 5 years ago.
Thank you. Okay,
Well,
we're going to move on. We're going to move on to the next question.
It did not
Ms.
prevent
Maloney.
them from getting a nuclear bomb, and after a certain number of
Ms.
years,
Maloney, we're going to
it
move
would have
on.
been legal to
We're going
have
to move
a
on to the
nuclear
next
bomb.
question.
Do you believe they have one now then?
We're going to move on to the next question.
Do you believe they have a nuclear bomb now? Because you said it didn't prevent Iran from getting a nuclear bomb. So Mr. Patel asked, do you think they have one now?
I don't know, but there are allegations that they're very close to getting one. And, and I hope that President Biden has said that he will not agree to any agreement unless it prevents them from getting a nuclear bomb. I support him.
Thank you.
Great.
Okay, we're going to switch topics now. Talk about another important topic on many of our minds, which is anti-Semitism, which is on the rise in New York and across the country, according to the data. One poll showed that 93% of American Jews are concerned about anti-Semitism. So how do you explain this growing hatred, and what specifically are you doing, or what would you do if in Congress to address it? We'll start with you, Mr. Patel, 60 seconds.
Well, as I said in my opening, this is a fear and a concern for all of us. I had swastikas painted on my signs 2 years ago in the East Village for my campaign against Congresswoman Maloney. Anti-Semitism and hate affect all of us, and we can't forget our history. That's why I'm running, because these forces of misinformation and hate are now spreading with the virality that we haven't had in decades. You see, there's a study done that every time a new form of mass media is invented, it's followed by a period of rising authoritarianism and populism. After the radio came World War I. After television came World War II. We are now in the digital age. It is incumbent upon us as a generation to ferry people across the other side so that when we get to the other side, everyone doesn't believe everything they read on the internet. In the meanwhile, you have to have people in office who understand these mediums and platforms of hate and want to regulate them.
Thank you. Mr. Nadler, same question. The growing hatred, and what are you doing, or what would you do about it?
Well, this growing hatred, well, let me just correct one thing Mr. Patel said. Television didn't become widely available until after World War II. Only a few homes had it before World War II. So that was not an explanation. But anti-Semitism has been rising. There's no question about it. Anti-Asian fever, prejudices of all types have been rising. We saw that at Charlottesville, Jews will not replace us. The great replacement theory that somehow Jews are directing the replacement of the Native American white population by populations of color. There's no question this is happening. There's no question it's very dangerous. And I've passed legislation to deal with it. I passed, along with Brad Schneider, the Domestic Terrorism Act, which gives government wide powers to crack down on the things that are creating this anti-Semitism and promoting it. And I've already done this, and it's gone into effect, and we'll hopefully wait to see how it works.
Thank you, Mr. Nadler. Ms. Maloney, same question.
How well it works, I should say.
Regrettably, it's on the rise. I used to think it was someplace way away. Now it's in my neighborhood. It's blocks away. It's my own office has been defaced. My colleague in government, Rebecca C. Wright, her office has been defaced several times. And what we do is we always hold hands, bring the community together, and speak out against it. But we have to do more than just speak. We have to act. So I authored a bill called the Never Forget Holocaust Education Program that I passed unanimously through the House and through the Senate. It was totally bipartisan, which I think Israel should always work for bipartisan support. And the bill would create in the really the Holocaust Museum in Washington, building on their already excellent research, lesson plans appropriate for every age so that teachers across the country could access it. It also is funded for $10
Congresswoman, you're out of
million. So the program is there, it's funded, it's helping teachers, it's getting
Congresswoman,
it,
I have
it's
to
there.
ask you to try to follow the timer. Yes, I think we can move on.
Yeah, I just want to respond to Congressman Nadler's quip. It said television, I meant mass media. I think everyone here has seared in their minds memories of videos of Hitler and Goebbels and a propaganda department burning of books and whipping people into frenzy.
Okay.
So let's just admit that video mattered there.
They were in movies.
Okay, great.
Good point.
We'll have a quiz on the timing of it.
Right. When were there
Inventions
VCRs?
of various technologies later at the end of the program.
I will lose that.
We should turn this into a quiz show. Okay, so another issue on which Mr. Nadler and Ms. Maloney differed was President Trump's move of the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem from Tel Aviv and recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital. At the time, Mr. Nadler, you criticized the timing and circumstances surrounding the timing, and Ms. Maloney, you supported it. You both are advocates of a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, as is Mr. Patel. So, Ms. Maloney, I want to ask you, what concrete steps would you take in this next Congress to advance the peace process? And do you think that President Trump's policy toward the Middle East, including the Abraham Accords, brought us closer or farther from the goal of a two-state solution? 60 seconds.
Oh, I applaud the Abraham Accords. I think it's a great step forward, and we should work with our individual contacts with other countries. I found it when the Secretary of State was there, or whether it was President Biden was in Israel and he flew to Saudi Arabia. That never would have happened before through their airs. I think it's a symbol of growing acceptance of Israel, and we should help to make it flourish in any way possible. I also thought it was interesting when Ukraine mentioned Israel and also Russia as one to negotiate the peace there. I think that showed a growing appreciation of Israel's leadership in the world. I find the Abraham Accords extremely encouraging, and certainly we need to. That is a way to build bridges, acceptance.
Thank
the Negev Desert
Thank you.
Symposium.
Mr. Patel.
Can I thank Janice Shorenstein for helping me pass? I just saw you in the audience for helping me pass the Never Again Holocaust
Mr.
Education
Patel, same question to you. So what concrete steps would you take in this Congress to promote the two-state solution or the peace process? And do you think that Trump's move of the embassy and negotiation of the Abraham Accords brought us closer or farther from the goal of a two-state solution?
Great question. So I think the Abraham Accords are a fantastic thing, and the expansion of them will be a fantastic thing, because a state that feels secure in its place, a Jewish state that feels that it's recognized and secure, can then have the ability to work towards a two-state solution. And having regional partners like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and the deepening of ties more recently here with Egypt and Jordan, will give Israel the security needed to, I think, move towards a two-state solution. And that should be negotiated by the Israelis and the Palestinians directly. And but I do support the Abraham Accords, and I do believe Jerusalem is the capital of Israel.
Great. Thank you. Well, I am trying to ask, but I think this may be elusive. What concrete steps would you take in the next Congress to try to bring about a solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, a two-state solution, et cetera? Mr. Nadler.
Well, you referenced my comments on moving the embassy to Jerusalem a number of years ago. I did think the time was not ripe in the sense that we weren't also opening a Palestinian embassy in Jerusalem, as the UN resolution of 1947 called for. We still haven't done that, and we should, because that's a two-state solution presumes the Palestinians will never accept a capital other than Jerusalem, nor will Israel, obviously. The Abraham Accords are a fantastic advance because they help bring about Israel's acceptance in the Middle East. I congratulate, it's probably the only thing in the world I congratulate President Trump for, and Jared Kushner for negotiating the Abraham Accords, and I'm glad to see that President Biden is trying to widen those accords and bring in Saudi Arabia. And I do think that one has to realize the strategic reason for that, which is that everybody is terrified of Iran.
Thank you. Ms. Maloney, you're the chair of the House Oversight Committee, which I think you mentioned. And when the White House is controlled by a different party from Congress, we usually see the House Oversight Committee. It's a tried and true tactic to drown the administration in oversight requests. But when the White House and Congress are controlled by the same party, oversight often takes a backseat to other priorities. So I would like to know one thing that you have done as chair of the Oversight Committee to take on the Biden-Harris administration, because you felt some of their actions raised questions that needed answers.
Oh, I think my bill for reforming the post office and pushing the administration to move to electrify. They had a contract going to buy all these new fleets of cars that were gas guzzlers for the post office, and I've been pushing very, very hard the administration to convert to electric. 70% of the contamination in our air and climate change problems come from fossil fuels, so if we could just get off of the cars, it would be a big solution. And the important part about the post office is if you turn all of the 3,500 offices into charging stations, then you basically have the infrastructure across the country. And I worked and pushed them very hard on this and also on the bill that they finally signed into law. But also in this new bill,
Thank you. Your time's up.
Time's up.
They just put $3 billion in, so we'll be able to electrify the entire fleet. I think that's a major accomplishment.
Thank you. Time. So, Mr. Nadler, the House Judiciary Committee is where some of the most contentious social issues in our society get debated, including reproductive health, guns, civil rights. You know this, I know this because I worked there when Henry Hyde was the chairman. And when these issues arise, it happens often through the introduction of legislation that's really designed to make more of a political point than get passed into law. So as the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, what's your proudest and most significant accomplishment?
Well, I have a number of proudest and most significant accomplishments. It's difficult to pick one. The legislation that we reported to codify women's right to reproductive freedom, the legislation that we passed through the House, by the way, the legislation we passed through the House to guarantee marriage equality for LGBTQ people, the antitrust legislation on the big tech companies that will greatly reduce costs for people. Those are some of the key things that we've done. I'll leave it at there. We've done a lot of. Let me just say, we've done a lot of other things. The House Judiciary Committee is the most productive committee in the House. About 40% of all legislation that goes, 30 or 40%, I'm not sure which, that goes through the House comes to our committee.
Thanks. Mr. Patel, if you are elected to Congress, what committees do you hope to serve on and why?
Well, President Biden's father used to say, because he always said it in speeches, don't tell me your values, show me your budget. And I firmly believe that that matters. So I would want to be on the Appropriations Committee. Here in New York City, we have the opportunity in this district with Mount Sinai and Presbyterian, with NYU Langone, to be a leader in medical research, in biotechnical research. There's an initiative called the Brain Initiative, which is seeking to map the human brain the way that we did the human genome. Currently, Congress funds it at $620 million. If that funding was doubled, much of it happening right here in New York City's 12th congressional district, we would map the human brain and cure things like Alzheimer's, dementia, and bipolar disorder. So I think we have a country right now that spends 9% of its federal budget on people under the age of 18. We have to reorient this budget to the future. And that's the committee I'd like to be on.
Great. Thank you. We're going to stick with you for one more minute.
Another quick comment on that. A quick comment.
20 seconds.
Let me just say that the Appropriations Committee is one of the most powerful committees. Lots of people want to get on it, and no freshman is ever assigned to the Appropriations Committee.
Fine. Great.
I cannot argue with that experience, but I cannot also emphasize or stress enough that reform is likely coming to the House. That seniority reform and limits on chairs and things are very likely coming to the House. Read any newspaper, and we know that.
Great. Thank you. Mr. Patel, we're going to stick with you for another question. You've made your case for generational change. We've asked each of the Congress members what their kind of proudest accomplishment on their committee is, and we want to hear a little bit about what you've accomplished in your career. Really pick one thing that is something you're most proud of and that has specifically positioned you to be successful in Washington.
Well, you know, I worked in the last few months for Secretary Clinton, or Hillary Clinton's campaign for president, and I was there at Javits Center on election night, and, you know, woefully drowned myself for the next few hours and days until I got up off the mat. And a group of us from the Obama administration formed an organization called The Arena. dedicated to equipping and training young people to run for office. My proudest accomplishment is getting thousands of people across the country to summits and forums that we had to bring people from digital and marketing spaces and accounting and lawyers to office and also to help support people running for office. Lauren Underwood and Andy Kim. I flew to Chicago to help Lauren Underwood's campaign launch when we built the arena. And I am incredibly proud of the fact that we took matters into our own hands and helped win back the House in 2018. We got 10 members of Congress elected, or helped get them elected. I'm not going to take credit because I've heard that the fiercest competition in Washington is for taking credit, and I am preparing for that. But I will just say that building an organization and getting people into office is important.
Thank you. Time. Ms. Maloney, 20 seconds to respond.
I wanted the opportunity to explain why I supported moving the embassy to Jerusalem. And it's because I think every sovereign nation has the right to choose where they want their capital to be, and that embassies should be where the capital is. That's why I supported it.
Thank you. All right. We'll do responses to the questions. Yeah. Go ahead, Mr. Nadler.
Let me just add to my last answer that I also passed the largest gun control legislation in 30 years and the assault weapons ban.
Okay, thank you.
We're not separating
may I
assets.
answer?
Thank you.
Guys.
Thank you. No, we're going to move on.
We're going to move on. We want to get back to our...
May I answer, because I think it's important? Everything that he mentioned has gotten through the House, but not the Senate. The bills that I have passed have been signed into law. I worked in a bipartisan way, and I got it through the House and the Senate.
Mr. Nadler, you want to respond?
Well,
20 seconds.
some of the legislation on guns that we passed didn't get through the Senate, but we passed the largest gun control legislation in 30 years that did pass the Senate, and the President signed it into law about 5 or 6 weeks ago.
Right. Okay. We're going to move on. So all three of you are on record as opposing the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement against Israel. But a growing portion of Americans, as you know, especially some younger Americans and younger Jews, support BDS. A poll last week put it at 30% of Democrats. And many more are concerned that anti-BDS laws, like the one both Mr. Nadler and Ms. Maloney voted for in 2019, can be anti-democratic and violate the First Amendment. There's also an increasing divide among Democratic elected officials around Israel and the Palestinians. So we have a three-part question. So what's the right way for a U.S. politician to fight against BDS? Is anti-Zionism inherently anti-Semitic? And does this divide among some Democrats over Israel concern you? Mr. Nadler, 60 seconds.
Well, I've been fighting BDS since 2001 when it first reared its ugly head after the Durban conference. I think I mentioned that already. It is not a question of free speech. Quite the contrary. BDS itself is a violation of freedom of speech because it denies Israeli academics, Israeli performers, the right to come here and speak. So BDS is anti-free speech. It is not the other way around, as some people would have it said. As to fighting it, I have led the fight in Congress against it. When you talk about the bill that passed against BDS, Brad Schneider and I wrote that bill and sponsored that bill, and those are some of the things you do to fight BDS. On the public, we need a large-scale educational effort about BDS, and there's no way around it. But I have been able to stop it dead in Congress and to make sure that it hasn't taken a foothold in the Progressive Caucus.
Thank you. Mr. Patel, same three-part question. The right way for a U.S. politician to fight against BDS is anti-Zionism inherently anti-Semitic, and does this divide around Democrats in Israel concern you?
Yeah, incidentally, in 2004, right after Congressman Nadler, I guess, I signed a letter at Stanford University where I went to undergrad, publicly opposing the BDS movement on my campus at a time when it was not very popular to do so as a student. And that letter is public in the Stanford Daily. And so I also oppose BDS. And I agree with Congressman Nadler's judgment that it is not a free speech issue to deny the ability of people to come to this country or to interact economically and things like that. So, but again, this comes back to my initial argument here for all of you, which is I am incredibly concerned that the next generation of Democrats are veering away from the stalwart support of the Jewish state of Israel and its right to exist. And we need messengers who can speak to that generation and ensure it doesn't drift away for good. And I'm the only one on this stage who can make that argument.
Thank you. Ms. Maloney, same question.
I think BDS is dangerous and a threat. I think it's BS. I think that there's a very thin line. There's a very thin line between BDS and anti-Semitism, and I think that Janice Shorenstein and I should work on another education bill that addresses it and gets it out into the community to counter it.
Thank you. So, Congressman Nadler, as you did tonight in your introduction, you have made a very big deal about the fact that you are the last Jewish member of the House delegation from New York City, the dean of the Jewish caucus, the most senior Jewish member, and that if you lose this primary, the most Jewish city in the country might not have a Jewish representative in the House delegation. I want to ask you, in a world of fluid identities and when Jewish representation overall in Congress is something like triple our percentage in the population, why does this actually matter?
It matters precisely because of some of the things we've been talking about today, the rising anti-Semitism in the country, and we have to have more and more attention and, frankly, political power to fight this anti-Semitism and to understand how to fight it and to have the people in Congress in particular who can talk to the left, which is the progressives, and keep them pro-Israel. We know that a lot of anti-Semitism comes from the right, and we need education, because I don't think they're going to listen to anybody in Congress. But a Jewish member of Congress who has the three positions that I have and has the ability to work with the progressives, has the ability and has shown the ability and the resource and the willingness to use the resources to prevent BDS from getting a foothold on the left.
Thank you. I want to give each of you 60 seconds to talk about your own perspective. Like, what do you make about Mr. Nadler's argument that it's critically important for New York to have a Jewish member of its House delegation?
Look, I want to also add that, first off, I would be the first South Asian member of Congress elected anywhere east of the Mississippi River, and the first in, I think, 6 or 8 years. And so I think, of course, representation is important. We need to have more women in Congress. We need to have more Jewish representatives. We need to have more South Asian and Asian American representatives. We need to have the ability to fight hate with representation and to make a new argument. But let's just talk about our shared values for a second. You know, one of the things that I realized campaigning on the Upper West Side and Upper East Side is that everyone a generation or two removed shares my family's story. Having left somewhere in Eastern Europe or voluntarily or forced, arrived at New York City, to the city that is the home of immigrants, and then started with nothing and built lives and security. And that is what I am talking about when I say that representation does matter. But it's about the values that we share. Everyone on this stage shares some of them.
Thank you. Ms. Maloney, what do you make of the importance of New York having a Jewish Congress member?
Well, we're very fortunate to have Senator Schumer, the leader of our Senate. He's a fabulous guy, and we're very fortunate to have Robert Zimmerman running for Congress, doing a good job, and Dan Goodman, who's running for Congress right now in New York, and doing a very good job. I think the important thing is what a person does, what they do, what they produce. When you're a member of Congress, has to react to everyone and take thousands of votes. We usually vote the same, but mainly the difference is that I have more of a record of getting things done, making things happen, passing legislation. And I think the main thing is, what is the person's merit? What is the person doing? Not only for members of the Jewish faith, but for all people, for the security of our country, for the health of our country, the education of our country. So it's not so much what your label is, but what are you doing with your time, your effort, to help people, help the community, help the district, help the city and state.
Thanks, Ms. Maloney. I'm going to stick with you for another second. One of the things that your opponents, particularly Mr. Patel, had attacked you on earlier in the campaign was some of the legislation that you had supported to study the effectiveness of vaccines and some of the support that you had given to some people who questioned the efficacy of vaccines. Earlier this week, you said that you regretted that. You regretted asking those questions and pushing for those studies. So I want to ask you why you supported those various anti-vax efforts this is long before COVID-19, this is starting 13 years ago, and what made you change your mind?
Well, I never supported anything anti-vax. I am pro-vaccine. I am pro-science. I have always voted for every vaccine law. I have brought over $5 billion to my district and to the city for vaccine centers, for free vaccines. I asked a question at a hearing that was 20 years ago, and one was a study. I don't think there's anything so controversial that you can't look at it and study it. And I will say that I have built 2 vaccine centers in my district, in Astoria Houses and Queensbridge. I think I'm the only congressperson in the whole country that has built 2 healthcare community centers that are providing vaccines. I don't know what more I can do to prove that I support vaccines. I'm vaccinated.
Thank you.
And,
Okay, great.
and I think you can go through anybody's record and find them asking a question or doing something. And I regret asking questions, maybe. But I tell you, I am totally vaccine. He's like a broken record. That's all he does. I have a record. He's a broken record, attacking me on the same thing over and over and over again.
We're going to give each of
How
your...
many vaccine centers have you put up, Mr. Patel?
Thank you,
And,
Ms. Maloney.
Mr.
Thank
Nadler,
you.
would like to, you can each have 20 seconds to respond, and then we're going to go to audience questions.
Regrettably, what Carolyn just said is untrue. For years, she introduced 9 bills against vaccines. She introduced resolutions. She tried
That
to
is
take.
not
she tried
true.
to take.
Please let
She tried to
Nadler.
take $80 million away from the CDC, and we
That
are
is not
and we are
true.
seeing the bitter results now, where people are not vaccinating their kids, are beginning to not vaccinate their kids for diphtheria, whooping cough, polio, measles, all the normal childhood vaccines because of the poison that she helped plant.
That is totally untrue, and I would say that I don't know how you can prove you're pro-vaccine more than creating vaccine centers and bringing $5 billion
Ms. Maloney,
to your city for vaccines.
But Ms. Maloney, what you're talking...
I think it's a cheap attack.
Congresswoman, what you're talking about is what you have done during the COVID-19 pandemic in terms of bringing vaccine centers to the city. And what they were talking about before was your support for studies that question the efficacy of vaccines. So earlier this week, you said you regretted it.
Okay, I regret it.
Great. Anything else to add, Mr. Patel? You have 20 seconds.
I wasn't going to bring up vaccines here at a forum about the U.S., about the Jewish community in New York, and I didn't do it as a broken record. This is a campaign about the future. Who has plans for the next 10 years to tackle livability, affordability, inflation, climate change, and secure the U.S.-Israel relationship and maintain that it remains bipartisan? That's what I came here to speak about, and that is what I'm going to continue speaking about.
Okay, great. Thank you. We are going to go now to audience questions. We have a bunch. Thank you so much, audience here and online, for these great questions. I love this first one, actually. And for each of you, you'll each have 60 seconds. So we've talked a bit about the strange situation we're in because of redistricting, and you all had some comments earlier about redistricting. So how would you reform the redistricting process so that we don't end up with a race like we see right now here in District 12? Why don't we go Nadler and Ms. Maloney in that order. 60 seconds.
Well, first off, I had a law professor, Samuel I. Zakharoff, that used to always say, call me old-fashioned, but I think voters should choose their politicians and not the other way around. I am firmly in opposition of gerrymandering, both incumbency protection gerrymandering, which is much more invidious in the U.S., in the history of the United States, than partisan gerrymandering, which has become more and more invidious, or actually in our face since Tom DeLay and, well, these last 2 cycles. So we should have redistricting be nonpartisan and non-incumbency protection everywhere across the country. And every time we put a referendum to the vote to the people themselves, as the voters of New York City in 2014 did, voters have chosen to take this out of the hands of career politicians. That includes red states like Ohio and North Carolina, which you are now seeing overturning maps. So we should go directly to the people and take the power out of the hands of the people who play the game. Politics is the only game where the players are also the umpires, who determine the time, place, and manner of their elections. And we ought to stop it.
Thank you. Mr. Nadler on redistricting.
Well, I am completely opposed to gerrymandering. Gerrymandering has always been partisan. It started off with the Federalists against the Anti-Federalists. Elbridge Gerry, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, gave his name to gerrymandering because he drew a district that looked like a salamander, according to his opponents. We adopted in New York a constitutional amendment in 2014 that is designed to stop gerrymandering. It sets up an independent redistricting commission, and it says that they propose the lines to the legislature, which must adopt it, and if it doesn't adopt it, goes back to the Independent Redistricting Commission. That wasn't followed. What happened here was that the Independent Redistricting Commission could not agree on a set of lines. The 5 Democrats came up with one plan, the 5 Democrats came up with another, and instead of sending it to the legislature, the courts stepped in. And the courts, I think, did something very wrong because Manhattan has been divided east-west since the 1870s. The Constitution says you're supposed to retain the cores of existing districts. The master split it north-south because he said it's neater, and that certainly doesn't retain the cores of existing districts.
Thank you. Ms. Maloney on redistricting.
Well, I am very disappointed at what happened, and I am very disappointed that we were drawn into the same district because we were colleagues and friends and worked together in a very productive way to help our city. I believe the way we could have changed it that might work in the future. The voters elected and voted for an independent redistricting commission. I think the mistake in the redistricting commission was that it was even, so that you couldn't have a decision. The Republicans voted one way, the Democrats the other, so there was no decision. I think going forward, if they had maybe 2 or 3 independent commissioners that aren't Republican or Democrat who could have voted to break that tie, then we would have moved forward with a much fairer redistricting plan for New York State. What has happened is really tragic for our state. We lost 1 seat, so we had to redraw, but the way it was redrawn with a special master from Pennsylvania who had no understanding of our communities, and I think it was drawn in a very partisan way, and I think the Republicans loved taking 2 powerful friends and chairmen and putting them in the same district.
Thank you, Congresswoman.
It's very damaging to our state. I regret it. But
thank
I
you.
think
You're
that
out of time.
that is a solution that might work going forward.
Okay. Thank you. 20 seconds.
On May 24th, Governor Hochul confirmed that our representatives in Washington and here drew their own lines. Earlier, Mr. Fandos, who's back there, reported in November, long before the commission deadlocked, that you already had plans in place to draw your own lines last November. And in fact, it's an obfuscation of the truth to say that Republicans drew this because that was not true. This was drawn by a special master.
Okay, thank you. Matt has... Sorry, you need to respond to that too?
Yeah, I do need to respond to it. First of all, neither Carolyn nor I had anything to do with redistricting districts last year. The legislature drew plans, not us. Second of all, I think what Carolyn just suggested is a good idea.
Great.
Thank you.
If we can find independence, it'll be great.
So the next question is for Mr. Nadler and Ms. Maloney. So this is an audience question. If you don't, and not both of you can't win, if you don't win the primary, will you continue to be an activist, and how will you go about doing that? Ms. Maloney.
Well, when I came to Congress, I had a list of 10 things I wanted to do. I've done all of them. In fact, I've done 70 more than what was on my list. There's one thing I haven't done. that I will continue to work on, and that is to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment. And I think that given the energy and the way that the Supreme Court has gutted women's rights, hopefully the anger and the organization will be there to finally come together and put women into the Constitution in the next 2 years. If I don't succeed, I will always work for it in or out of office. I think it's important for the country. When women succeed, our country succeeds. Women deserve to be in our Constitution. They could not have done what they did to us with Roe if we were in the Constitution, because we would have been protected from discrimination. And I can't think of anything more discriminatory
Thank you.
than telling women what to do with their own bodies. It's their decision. There is no democracy.
We're going to move on.
If women can't make decisions on their own bodies.
It's Mr. Nadler's turn.
Mr. Nadler, 60 seconds.
Well, I will continue to do what I've always done, fighting for women's rights, fighting for gay rights, fighting for transportation improvements for the city and the state. Those are things I'll concentrate on, as I always have. And I'll concentrate on one other thing, and that's the bill that I introduced to expand the Supreme Court by 4. McConnell and Trump packed the Supreme Court by not giving Merrick Garland a hearing on the grounds that, well, it's only a year till the next presidential election, the next president should suggest it, and then forcing through Amy Coney Barrett with days before the next election. They packed the court so that we will get terrible results for the next 30 years. The way to fix that is to counterpack the court by adding 4 new Democratic appointees.
So, great segue, Mr. Nadler, thank you, because our next audience question is about the Supreme Court. So, I'm going to ask, it's a 2-part question. What are your thoughts about ending the lifetime tenure of Supreme Court justices? And how do you feel about term limits for Congress and Senate? But I'd like to add the expansion of the Supreme Court to this question. So we'll have 3 questions for each of you, but still within 60 seconds. We can start with Mr. Patel. Thoughts about expanding the Supreme Court, ending the lifetime tenure of the Supreme Court, and term limits for Congress?
First off, we should expand the Supreme Court. There are 13 circuits in the United States of America. There's only 9 Supreme Court seats. There should at least be a Supreme Court seat per circuit. Abraham Lincoln did it, and FDR almost did it. And you know, so there is precedent for this, and I think it should be expanded. And I think that expansion should be paired with 15-year term limits for Supreme Court justices. That is, you know, supported by over 70% of Americans, according to polling, because what this has become is sort of a farce, a political farce, and everyone knows it. And then, if we must pair that expansion and term limit with term limits for all, then I absolutely support that as well. Because I think that we do need to continuously refresh the ranks of our leadership with people who have the experience in the real world, in our economy, that you know, that make sure that their representation is reflective of the country. I'm 38 years old, by the way, if anyone is wondering how young I am. That makes me a median adult male in this country. I'm halfway through my life, believe it or not. And the idea that someone like me is too young to be in office is, I think, is absurd.
Thank you. Mr. Nadler, next to you. You already told us you think the Supreme Court should be expanded, so should we end lifetime tenure of Supreme Court justices? And what about term limits for Congress?
Well, I would favor ending a lifetime tenure for Supreme Court justices, but I have real questions about its constitutionality. The Supreme Court says judges should serve during good behavior, and that would say you can't have term limits. There are some constitutional scholars who think that, well, if you took a Supreme Court judge and made him a circuit court judge, he would still be serving during good behavior, and you could do that. I hope that's true, but I don't know. I think there are very severe constitutional questions about Supreme Court term limits. As for congressional term limits, I'm very much opposed to them. I think we have congressional term limits. Every 2 years, the electorate gets to choose, and if people think someone is doing a good job, they should vote for him or her. If people don't think so, they can always change. And we always have churning in Congress. We always have new members coming through and through, but the sovereignty of the electorate can only be sustained if you let people vote for what they want.
Thank you.
I support expanding the Supreme Court. I support looking at term limits for justices, particularly these justices that are making these decisions. And we have term limits. No other profession has to run for office every 2 years. No doctor has to go take another exam and go through school again. It's very hard. Every 2 years we have a term limit. And I would say that for myself, and I would say probably for Jerry too, the longer we serve, the better we get, the better we learn. It's a complicated business, and it's dependent on contacts and knowledge, and the longer I serve, the better I get at being able to help the great city of New York and the people that I represent. And I'm very much opposed to term limits. We have them already, and why deprive
Thank you.
people of someone that is working hard and making results and bringing change? Also, if
Thank you. That your time's up. Thanks.
I just want to respond to that. The rest of us do have term limits. If we're ineffective, we can get fired the next day. When over 90% of incumbents continuously win election, and you just got done telling us that gerrymandering has rigged the system across this country, then perhaps the people aren't sovereign to actually choose their representatives based on effectiveness, or else Congress, with about a 20% approval rating, wouldn't continuously return 90% of its members back every 2 years.
Go ahead.
The solution to that is to eliminate gerrymandering, but allow the people to do what they want.
Thank you. All right, we have come towards the end of our evening. We are going to now have a lightning round of some questions. And we are not going to use the timer on this. We are asking for really answers of like a single word or phrase, or I think in one case maybe a full sentence. But we will cut you off if you go on. We do not want you to explain your answers. We want you to just give answers. I know this is hard for you, but I mean, it's hard for me too, honestly. But we're going to try it, okay? And for the first question, we'll start with Ms. Maloney and then go that way. Okay, so we would like you to give a letter grade to the Biden administration overall so far. Letter grades, I'll remind you, go from A to F. You may use pluses and minuses if you like. Each of you, please give the administration a letter grade.
I would give it an A, the American Rescue Plan.
Just a letter grade. Thank you.
Okay.
I'd give it an A.
A.
Okay. Using the same scale, I'm going to ask you to grade New York City Mayor Eric Adams.
We can go the opposite direction.
Starting with you, Mr. Patel.
NA, not enough data available. Okay, I'll give a B plus for trying. And we just don't have enough data available yet.
Okay, Mr. Nadler.
I'll give it a B minus because of demagoguery on bail reform.
Ms. Maloney.
I have to call his administration practically every other day on something for my constituents, so I'd better give him an A. I want him to
Okay,
return
great
my
inflation
phone
over here.
calls. I want
Great,
him to
thank
return
you.
my phone calls.
Okay. This is not a letter grade now. We'll start with Mr. Nadler. What is your favorite restaurant in the 12th district? Your favorite restaurant in the district?
Utopia Diner on the west side.
Ms. Maloney?
Zabar's and Eli's.
For the record, that's two places. Okay, Mr. Patel.
I'm going to answer honestly, actually. Gup Shop in Gramercy, which is an Indian restaurant that's owned by a friend of mine. It's just delicious. You should all try it out.
Okay, so the next question is more than a single word answer. What is a quote that inspires you? Start with you, Mr. Nadler.
Give me liberty or give me death.
Mr. Patel.
Yes, we can.
Ms. Maloney.
Equality.
Okay. This is becoming a classic forward question. So, and it can be a whole sentence. What is your standard bagel order? Type of bagel, toppings, where you buy it, all the details that you require. Ms. Maloney, you can start us off.
Well, there's a bagel store right next to my office on 3rd Avenue and 93rd Street, and I like toasted poppy seed with cream cheese.
Thank you. Mr. Nadler.
Tile Bagels on Broadway and 91st Street. And my favorite bagel is poppy seed bagel with lox and tomato.
Mine just got barely cut out of the district now, Tompkins Square Bagel at Tompkins Square. I'm a everything egg bagel toasted with salmon, with lox, tomato, onion, and jalapeno cheddar cream cheese. I'm a complex person.
I have a closing question from the audience. Great. Do we want to do any more lightning round, Matt? We do have a little bit
Well, maybe
of time.
one, yeah. How about this? New York, since I've come here, I've learned and seen about all the colorful individuals who have served in office in New York City, who currently serve or have served. Who is your role model in New York politics? And you can't say yourself. Mr. Nadler.
Fiorello LaGuardia.
Ms. Maloney.
So I've got 3. Shirley Chisholm, Bella Abzug, and Geraldine Ferraro. All great women, great mentors.
Great. Mr. Patel.
Robert Kennedy.
Great. So we had not planned on closing statements, but we got this question from the audience that I think is a good opportunity for you to give a closing statement. It will expand on some of the things you've already said, so thank you, audience. And the question is, what do you love about being a New Yorker? So we'll give you 60 seconds each to say what you love about being a New Yorker, starting with Mr. Nadler.
I love the vitality of the city. You can see everything from the Metropolitan Museum to the Hayden Planetarium to Riverside Park. The vitality of the city is amazing, and nothing matches it in the world.
Thank you. Ms. Maloney.
I love the people. They're dynamic, they're strong, they're interesting, they're change makers. And I love the fact, this one factoid, that New Yorkers live longer than anyone else. Did you know that? And some people think it's the health care, it's because we walk everywhere, and I say it's because we're all too busy to die.
And there's a quote, there's the next quote that inspires the next person, too busy to die. Mr. Patel, what do you love about being a New Yorker?
I moved here for law school and at NYU, and I remember getting on the West 4th subway stop after being asked the existential question that all New Yorkers get asked every week or so, which is, do you want to add value or do you want to add time? I chose to add value. I got on that subway. I remember looking around and seeing people, black, white, purple hair, platform shoes, you name it. And I realized this is home. People from all across the world, from 160 plus countries, 50 states, all the cities in the country, come on boats and trains and buses and planes, and they come to the city, New York City, to make it home. It's an incredibly inspiring place. And we're on the verge of a historic, only in New York moment, where a challenger who's coming at this race against 2 storied incumbents may make history and become the first person of color elected to this district or in lower Manhattan, and to actually make generational change happen here with the votes of people from every demographic and age group, because change is what we need.
Thank you so much. I want to, we're going to get...
Rabbi Davidson.
Okay, well, I just wanted to thank Rabbi Davidson, first of all, for having us. Thank all of the candidates.
Yes, thank you.
For being with us and for trying to stick to time. I want to quickly thank Matt, my partner in putting this on, and Gadi Levy and Ari and Erica here at the Streicker Center, and all of our partners. Thank you so much for having us, and thank you for being with us. And thank you to the audience for these great questions.
Jody Redoran, Matt Nozenchuk, Representative Carolyn Maloney, Representative Jerry Nadler, Suraj Patel. Thank you all for being here. Don't forget to vote. And to many of you,
August 23rd.
an early Happy New Year.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
You give me a hard time. Well, it was 20 years ago. I mean,
You're running on the record, right?
Can we just do one picture?